After adopting the minutes, we will get an update from Councilmember Tolbert about action by the council and have an opportunity, if anyone has any questions, for you to pose those to him. Then we will go through our post-meeting survey summary from the last meeting. And then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of what came out of last week's really rich and interesting discussions together, and the Google Doc that we were all populating with our ideas, as we talk a little further today about policy outcomes and goals for rent stabilization, kind of before we start getting into policy choices or mechanisms. Then, as everyone knows, the second half of our meeting is our special expert guest presenter, Ken Barr, joining us from the other side of the world. So we will try to make sure to get our break taken at the end of the first hour so that we have that full second hour with him. And then at the very end, we'll just have just a minute to kind of preview what is on the schedule for next week's meeting. So that is our agenda. If someone could put up the minutes from our week 5 meeting, that would be, or rather, everybody has the minutes in your email, and the question is whether to approve any edits or corrections needed to the minutes that anyone saw. Feel free if you find anything, you know, we can make those adjustments here before we vote. If not, then go ahead and vote. And why don't we take a look at the results? Great, thank you all for participating in the vote. So with that, I will turn it over to Councilmember Chris Tolbert to give an update on things that the council has done recently, and an opportunity if anyone has any questions about that to ask Councilmember Tolbert.
Thank you, Philip, and good afternoon, everybody. Good to be here with you as always. Philip asked me to brief the group on a resolution that the council passed unanimously last week. And I should start by maybe prefacing that this is different than some of the ordinance changes that the council was making that we've been discussing the last few weeks. There are some implementation ordinances, and I know many on this group know about it because quite a few came and testified before the council who also are on this group. But the council also simultaneously, as this group well knows, passed a resolution in hopes of giving some guidance and instructions and maybe some scope to this group about what would be helpful in terms of the final report and the feedback that the council and the mayor are looking for as this group works towards a final product. And we sent it over to Ed and the team, and hopefully we can pass it out to everybody, the resolution that if it hasn't been sent out, I hope that we can. And we try to do it in a very basic, very simple way so that it's easy to refer back to. And what we did is we passed a resolution basically posing 10 questions or 10 different topics that would be helpful for this group to talk about and possibly come back with recommendations on. And people can read it themselves, but just things like how to ensure stable rental rates in St. Paul, how to implement an exemption for new residential construction, talking about a rent increase cap or vacancy decontrol, how to ensure compliance with a rent stabilization ordinance, how to ensure that maintenance and reinvestment happens in properties, and then just a general best practices that we've learned from other jurisdictions on implementing rent stabilization. So nothing that should be out of things that we've talked about in depth and that's been part of the agenda, but we thought it would add additional structure to this group as something to work towards in that final document. If we can pass that out to everybody, people can read it. It's pretty short. We tried to keep it short purposely. And I'd be happy to answer any questions on that. But I should say, I worked with all my colleagues on this. This took quite a bit, and it passed unanimously. Council member Prince was out of town last week, so she wasn't at the council meeting, but with my conversation, she would have been supportive of it as well. I believe, I don't want to speak for her, but based on the conversations that we had, but everybody else was there last week. So
thank you, Councilmember Tolbert. And yeah, the floor is open. Anyone have questions for him about the new resolution?
So I have a question, Chris. Was this based on any input from the task force, or was this just something that the council came up on their own?
A little bit of both. Many of my colleagues have been watching the task force, and I think, I've heard a lot of feedback of what are we working towards and what kind of topics is the council looking for. And ultimately, because the council will be, as the only entity that has the legal authority to make ordinance changes, we thought it would be helpful to give some direction of what we think would be helpful. Obviously, it's not limited to this. If the group feels very strongly about a topic that hasn't been covered here, or doesn't want to take a position on one of these, it's up to the group as a whole. But we thought it would help bring some structure around the conversations that we're having, since we are working towards a kind of a date deadline report from this group. So
we are going to receive those resolutions then, or that resolution?
Yeah, I apologize. I thought it was already passed out. We can put it in the chat. There should be a link to the council agenda I could put in the chat here.
Okay.
When I'm done answering questions, I can put it in the chat if someone doesn't beat me to it.
And we should be able to also make sure it goes up on the website for the group. Other questions for Councilmember Tolbert?
Thank you, Carrie.
If not, just really appreciate your leadership in bringing this about. It, I think, gives additional clarity to the kind of mission, purpose, function, and reporting that our task force will be doing. Oh, I see there is a question. Malik.
Hi, I see that a lot of the bullet points are either specifically geared towards tenants or the general community as a whole, but I don't see any bullet points or topics that are specifically geared towards owners of investment properties. Can you tell me what your position is, if you think that renters and homeowners should have a fair stake in it, or if your specific position is that renters should have control of the conversation?
So in my opinion, this resolution, it's to kind of bullet point the topics that we'd like this group to discuss and come back with some resolution on that. It's not intended to take hard positions on any of that. This is why the mayor convened this task force, is to have these conversations about how to balance those things. I think, even looking at bullet point, let's look at number 9. That's one of the things about well-maintained buildings. That's something that I've heard from renters. I've heard from this conversation last week. People want to live in well-maintained buildings. We've also heard from property owners, landlords, or whatever we want to call them, that they need a certain amount of money to keep the apartments well-maintained. And so it's, how do you balance those two things? And those, I think that's the needle that this group is trying to thread. So I don't think it's necessarily a hard position or anything like that. It's to give structure to the conversation that we've been having and will continue to have for the coming months, I suppose.
Well, since you're here, I would like you to side one way or the other, or you can opt not to answer the question altogether. But are you of the position that renters and homeowners should be a fair understanding as far as whatever the decision is made? Or do you think that renters should be favored, or do you think that owners should be favored in the decision?
I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean. And I mean, I'm here every week, by the way, I'm on this committee, but
Well, I know, but since we're having a conversation, I'm just curious if you would say one way or the other, if you think it should be fair. Fair meaning the tenants get something that they're in favor of, owners get something they're in favor of, and they both agree to disagree on a particular topic, that's fair. If all three topics, all renters agree to, no homeowners or investors agree to, that's not fair. So I'm asking you, is it your position that it should be fair or it should be tilted one way or the other?
well, I can't, for my position, and this is how I do my job on every issue, is I think that our job is to take all the best information that you have at a time, listen to what people say, and make the best and fair decision. So I always strive for fairness. I'm not here with some agenda, but other than to try and do what's best for St. Paul and the people of St. Paul.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Councilmember Tolbert. Any other questions about the resolution that was introduced by the City Council last week, or adopted by the City Council last week? All right.
And if people have additional questions, Philip, they can reach out to me directly. I have my email or whatnot. I know how people, so thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you. So with that, I will turn it over to the Cura team to go through the survey results from last week.
Great, thank you very much, Philip. So as before, we sent you the set of post-meeting survey comments that you made, and as before, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at all of them. They're always interesting to see, but again, they are not numerous enough to sort of break into themes. But there are two things that I would like to pull out of last week's post-survey comments. One was that there was a fairly good response to the use of the Google Doc and the small group breakouts. And so we're going to try to repeat that in the exercise that we do today. And we'll keep that in mind for moving forward. I think many people found that as a useful way to be able to express themselves and then to generate and guide a conversation. The second thing that I would say about some of the responses in the post-meeting survey is there have been some questions about why we are comparing St. Paul to cities like San Francisco and New York. And so I want to sort of clarify what we're doing with these examples that we take from San Francisco and Oakland and New York, et cetera. We're not really attempting to compare, and we're not meaning to compare St. Paul with these other cities. What we are doing is essentially using information from the rent stabilization approaches of other cities to illustrate the choices and the options that are available to St. Paul. So there's no implicit comparison or sense that the cases are the same, other than to provide the group with policy design choices. And so that's the reason why we reference these other cities. And of course, we're constrained by the cities that actually have rent stabilization. And so that's why you don't see other medium-sized Midwestern cities in the illustrations, is because there are no cases of cities like that have rent stabilization for us to look at. So just a word of clarification on that. And then I guess, Philip, if there's no other comments, I'd like to move to the next item on the agenda.
Yep, just pause to see if there's any comments or questions for Ed.
Okay.
If not, then go right ahead.
Okay. All right. All right. So I want to remind you of what we did last time, and then to talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. So we did break out into small group discussions, and we brainstormed responses to the question, what outcomes would a good rent stabilization program produce in St. Paul? And so you had your conversations, you looked at it from the standpoint of renters, and then from the perspective of property owners. And the full list of comments that you generated in your groups were sent out to you last Friday. And then yesterday you were sent a summarized version of the comments. And those comments were organized into 12 statements. And that's what we want to sort of work from today as a starting point for your deliberations. Today, we want to give you a chance to respond to that list of 12 statements. Is there agreement about those? Is there disagreement? Would you recommend wording changes or changes of emphasis, or is something altogether missing in that process or in that list of 12? And to remind you, and of course you've had this list, but these are the statements that we pulled from the process that you underwent last week. A good and effective rent stabilization program for St. Paul would, 1, provide stability of residence and affordable housing for St. Paul renters. It would provide renters with predictability in their housing costs. It would prevent rent gouging. It would provide property owners with the ability to recoup expenses for operational costs and property maintenance, and a reasonable rate of return on their investment. It would result in continued maintenance of property, providing renters with decent, safe, and clean living environments, and providing property owners with properties that remain in good shape in the long term. It would also allow and encourage the upgrading of the rental housing stock through capital improvements. It would result in the expansion of the rental housing stock and housing options in St. Paul through new construction by continuing to attract investment and financing to that part of the market. A good program for St. Paul would operate through a clear and transparent and simple set of regulations and processes so that all parties have a good understanding of the system. It would be efficient and it would process petitions and claims quickly. It would have regulations and procedures that are fair to all parties. And it would produce good communication between renters and property owners. And it would produce stable communities in the city. So these are the organizing themes that came out of your work and what we would like you to do is to use this list as the basis of your discussions today, essentially asking you whether this is a good representation of your conversations and whether you agree that these are the kinds of outcomes we're looking for in a rent stabilization program in St. Paul. So today we're going to go back into small groups, not quite as small as last week. We're going to go into 5 different groups of up to 8 people. And at the beginning of the small groups, there will be some time that is set aside for each of you to record your individual thoughts about this list of 12. There is a Google Doc that we will make available, which we will show you the link to, where you can jot your ideas. And then we would break into discussions, right? Where you can talk with each other about the list of 12 or whichever ones that among that list that you are interested in. And before doing so, I do want to, on the basis of some of the feedback we received last week, just remind everyone about the ground rules that we adopted in the first couple of weeks of our deliberations, about being true and real to your experience, and giving space for people to be vulnerable when they speak of their own experiences, acknowledging and respecting differing opinions and perspectives, and the rest. Just a quick reminder as we go into the into the small group discussions about how we have agreed in the past to conduct our business in that manner. So those are the, oh, I'm sorry, number 12 was cut from the screen. I did read it at the end. That was the one about producing stable communities in the city. Thank you. Sorry about that.
And all of the statements are right at the start of the Google Doc when you open up that link.
Right. So when you go to the Google Doc to find your group, all of the 12 statements are there for your reference as well. So
just to ask, are there any questions about what we're about to do before we break into breakouts? Okay.
So just to be clear, we're going to break into our breakouts and then we'll have time to fill out the Google Doc individually, or?
Yeah, there will be time for you to write down your individual comments on the Google Doc form. And so each breakout group will take 5 minutes or so that all of the members can do that. And then you can start the conversation.
Okay, so we'll be in our breakout groups then as we respond to the Google Doc. And
Right.
then after 5 minutes, we can start to share.
Right. That's
Great.
yes.
Okay, just wanted to make absolutely clear.
Right.
And I'll point out that we have a Cura staff member assigned to each group who will be there to act as note takers and facilitate as needed. And that the Google Doc will function like last week, where there's a different section for each letter. So if you, so you'll need to scroll down the Google Doc and find the letter of your group before you begin commenting.
And then I'm going to put everyone into breakout rooms. I am hosting breakout room B. So if you happen to be in breakout room B, I'm going to be just a couple minutes late joining. So for people that are in breakout room B, if you can go ahead and start looking at the statements and just, again, typing in your thoughts into that document, then I'll come back in and we can do introductions and kind of proceed from there. So I'll just take a few minutes to get there. All right, so I'm opening up the rooms here. And people should be starting to go into there. John Grevner, do you see the Google document didn't have the breakout rooms in it, the PDF file that document that I sent you?
Trupti, the PDF document that you sent me was a screenshot of the agenda slide. So if you're able to resend the breakouts, that'd be helpful.
Okay. Let me see what. Oh, can you scroll down on there on the PDF document?
I'll try.
And Trupti, which group did you want me to join again?
I
can do group C. That makes a lot of sense for me.
Okay.
So B, C, and D are covered. Then Tony, you want A or E?
I'll do.
I'm B.
Yeah, A or E as in Edward.
Oh, sorry.
I'll do E.
Okay, I'll go into A.
Okay.
John, do you see the
I do. I see it. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So in case anyone pops in and out, there at the very bottom, there's a breakout room. And when you open that up, you'll see the name at the top. And then you can just assign them to a room. You can hover over the person's name and then assign them to their room.
Perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yep. I'll watch folks to join here.
Okay. And some people may drop off and come back in. That's why I realized that at the end. So that's kind of why it's a little emergency to you. So
sounds good. I'll be right here.
And then if you want to, you should be able to share your screen if you guys want to pop up that breakout room slide for the live stream. So, all right.
Professor Getz, do you intend to be here or did you want to be put back in room A? Oh, you're on mute though.
I'm trying to resolve an issue for one of my members in breakout room A. I'm going to go back in a second.
Got it. Okay.
Hello, could I be sent to a breakout room?
Hey, Ken, it's John. I just wanted to let you know that folks are in breakouts, but we'll be coming back here soon.
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay.
And you may want to be on mute ahead of folks coming back. And I will let the Cura team know that you have arrived as well.
What did you say? I should go back on mute?
You may want to be on mute ahead of people coming back, and I'll let the Cura team know that you have arrived.
Okay.
Snap. Sorry about that, group. I didn't even see the timing ever coming back. Sorry about that. For those in group C, I know we're going to come back together, and so we can kind of continue that conversation before we go back into the small group again, before we head to the next aspect of it. So thanks.
So welcome back, everybody. I know really good discussion, the small group I was in. We're a little behind time, but I want to just honor that people probably could use a quick break. So can we do 5 minutes tops, and then we'll introduce our speaker and dig in? Thank you.
Quick question, Philip. I wanted to
Go right ahead.
I wanted to log off my phone and get on my laptop. Would you be able to bring me back in the room, or is there anything I could do to kind of?
I don't manage that, but Tripti, are you listening? Did you hear that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, we're going to be all in the same group, so there shouldn't be any problem, Malik, in you getting back into the room.
Thanks.
Yeah, I will look for you and make sure we get you into the right place. Are we going to, Ed, just so I know, are we going to go into another small group session at some point, or we're staying in the large group until the end here?
Not today. Not today.
Okay. And then one more quick point. We were in discussion. We were doing a lot of really good conversation. So maybe just at the end, could we maybe give people a little bit of time to make comments into the document, maybe after Mr. Barr's presentation? So maybe leave it open until like 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock before we lock it.
That's fine. I see some people making additions as we speak. So.
Yeah. Just want to make sure everyone has a chance to add in thoughts as they're absorbing the information and thinking about the conversations.
Okay. So then when we come back, okay, Ken can already share his screen, right? We've got that. So when we come back, then I'll do an introduction of Ken and then turn it over to him.
Okay, it's 2:05. So if you're back, you can flip your camera back on, or otherwise let us know that you're here. And Ed, are you doing the introduction for our guest speaker?
Yes, I will.
Right ahead.
All right, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you Ken Barr, who will be speaking to us from his wealth of experience. Ken is an attorney with a law degree from the University of California. He has a PhD in urban planning from UCLA. He has consulted on issues of rent stabilization in literally dozens of cities. He's consulted on the drafting of rent stabilization ordinances. He's the author of at least 15 articles on rent control and rent stabilization, more if you count chapters in books. And several of these have been cited by the California Supreme Court, the New Jersey Supreme Court, and various appellate courts in decisions that they've made on rent stabilization cases. He has completed studies of the performance of rental housing investments in San Jose and in Los Angeles, and has worked with cities in California, Maryland, and New Jersey. And so I'm really pleased that he has taken the time to be with us. It's 5 o'clock in the morning where Ken lives. And so that makes it all the more remarkable. But without any further ado, I'll turn it over to him and just say, welcome, Ken. Thanks for being here.
Okay. Good afternoon for you. Not for me. I'm in Australia, if you're wondering where it's 5 in the morning. And first of all, I know you've been hearing a lot about rent control, and you know it's a very general term that describes a lot of different things. First, I want to say a little bit about our housing landscape. And when I say the landscape, I think there are a lot of things that are there all the time, and therefore, in a way, we don't even notice them. And one is we have a widespread belief that the market will provide a balance between supply and demand. And we have a premise that we're operating in a free market. But in fact, I think you should look at it the other way. Apart from rent controls, the supply of housing is heavily regulated in the United States. We have, and as you know, we have rules about apartment construction, where apartments can be built, how dense, how high, parking requirements, minimum dwelling sizes, strict prohibitions on our cheapest form of housing, manufactured housing, very strong prohibitions on where it's going to be placed. And I'm not saying these are right or wrong, but the point is we don't have a free market in the supply of housing. It's a very heavily regulated supply. So rent control is not an interruption in the free market, it's an intervention in a market in which the supply is heavily regulated. And when we look at the impact of, or debate about the impact of rent control on the supply of apartments, first of all, most rent control laws permanently exempt units that have been built after the adoption of the law. Some provide exemptions for specific periods, for example, the first 10 years after a new building is built. And when you look at, the apartment construction, the volume of it, it's incredibly complex to isolate particular factors because of the volume of apartment construction. It's affected by land use regulations. It's heavily affected by interest rates. It's affected by the overall performance of the economy, returns on other investments, and also even impacted by the tax laws. And at different times, I've done studies of new construction in the San Francisco Bay Area, which has had a very hot housing market for years. And one thing in the findings has been a substantial percentage of the cities have had virtually no apartment construction. And I wouldn't say it's because of, it's not, obviously it's not because of rent control, and it's not because people don't want to live in apartments in those communities. It's because half the communities have very stringent controls on building apartments. And the highest rates of construction have actually been, to a great extent, among the cities that do have rent control. So the other thing is, I want to talk about the impact of rent control on rents. And we have lots of debates about how rent control affects new construction and maintenance, but there's very little discussion about how rent control impacts rents. And I'm going to share, let's see if I can. I'm going to share a screen with you. And I hope, have I set it up so it's all visible?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, you can see the whole thing. Just a second. I have to adjust it. And basically what I have here is a comparison over 5-year periods.
I'm
of the
sorry, Ken.
Yes.
I think maybe we're seeing your Windows screen right now. We're not seeing an image or a spreadsheet. We're not seeing the actual data. We might be seeing the wrong screen.
Just a second. Okay, I'm doing something wrong. New share. Is it coming on now?
Yep, there you go.
Okay.
There it is.
Yeah, I'm not very conversant with Zoom. And so, okay, this table, it compares rent increases over a 5-year period with the increase in the CPI all items. And what you will see in this, go to Minneapolis, St. Paul on the left side, there are 5-year periods where the rents have increased by less than the CPI. Let's say, look at 19.
Can you enlarge that? It's the figures are very tiny.
Okay. Afraid they're too big now. Are they visible now? Is this better?
I think you're getting the
I
thumbs
think
up.
so, yes.
Yep.
Oh, thumbs up. Okay. Okay. So you look at, for example, St. Paul, look on the left side, 1980 and 1990, and you see in those 5-year periods, rents increased by less than the CPI. And then you go to 2000, starting in 2000, rents went up, the all items index went up 16%, the rent index went up 21%. In 2005 and 2010, rents went up a little less than the CPI. In the last 10 years, the housing market has gotten tighter, and you can see that the rents have gone up more than the CPI. And the other columns basically just, I didn't want to just have Minneapolis in this chart. I put the US, Houston, and San Francisco just as examples because they're different housing markets. But the main point is rents increasing by more than the CPI is a normal condition in the market, but also rents increasing by less than the CPI is also a normal condition in unregulated markets. And so when you're debating, so the next thing I want to talk about is the impact of rent control on the returns from rental properties. And I'm going to hopefully in a not clumsy way share another screen with you. Okay, is this screen up now? Return on cash investment?
No.
Nope.
Oh. Just a second. I see it on my screen.
I think if you wait to share your screen until you've opened the document, what we're seeing is you went to share your screen and then we see your file names. So if you unshare it and then reshare it.
Okay, I'm sorry. Is it open now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, basically, the critical thing not, can you see this clearly now? That it's 2 pages, if you can see the first page.
Yep.
Can you see? Yes? Okay.
We can.
Okay. The critical thing to understand when you're looking at the rental housing business is that about 40%, or let's say 50% of rents go to cover operating expenses for buildings. The balance goes to net operating income. And the net operating income is return on investment, which could be covering mortgage payments or providing a cash return, depending on how much you borrowed and how much cash you put in, et cetera. And the critical point to understand here is that what you have rent regulation, unless you restrict the rent increases to only half the CPI increases, what you're impacting through the rent regulation is how much the net operating income is and how much it grows. And a critical point is that housing investments are generally leveraged investments, and a typical mortgage ratio to purchase price is about 70%. So here I have a hypothetical, rental income is 100,000, 40,000 is operating expenses, 60,000 net operating income. And the building value, here I used a cap rate of 6%, meaning if you divide the net operating income by 6%, you'll get the value of the building, because in the housing market, typical and varies from place to place and building to building, but people will pay $1 million to get a net operating income of 60,000. Now that ratio, that cap rate varies over time. There were times back around 2000, the interest rates were a lot higher. So people demand, the cap rate was much higher. The higher the cap rate, the lower the values are relative to the rents. But now, of course, because, if you put your money in the bank, you get practically a 0 return. So a 6% rate of return is a good return on investment. And so then looking at this, because this is a leveraged investment, your return on your investment is much higher than the appreciation rate of the building. So look at the second column, which is the current year, and you see the rental income is increased by, I'm assuming the CPI went up 40% over time. The rental income went up 40%. The operating expenses, as you can see, went up 40%. The net everything went up 40%. And the building, and therefore the net operating income went up 40%. Therefore, the value of the building went up 40%. Well, the mortgage, I assume that didn't increase. You had some sale cost, but then what happens is your net equity has gone up 96%. So basically, this is the owner's investment or skin in the game. The bank has the rest of the skin, the mortgage, and you've gotten a very high rate of return on your equity. It's a leveraged investment. If you buy a house for 200,000 and it goes up to 240,000 in value, you can say, well, it's only gone up 20% in value, but you probably only, invested $40,000, so your equity is doubled. And this is what you have to look at in looking at what you're impacting by rent regulation and how investments work in housing. Now, the second page, I have the same table, except the rents are only going up by 80% of the CPI. And what's happened here is the net, basically the value has only gone up 27%, even though the value of the property has gone up. I mean, the rents, so even though the inflation has been 40%, the value's only gone up 27%, but the equity has increased by 89%, but then I subtracted, that's for sale cost, assuming sale costs are 8% of the price, and still the equity is increased by 55%. So in a market where the rents have going up a little less than the full CPI, you still have, it's a good investment because your return on your cash investment is going up much more or more than the CPI. But of course, if you reduce the rent increases so they're only 50% of the CPI, then you're not going to have any increase in equity. And so, and of course, in this table, you can debate the different assumptions about whether the cap rate should be different, et cetera. The sale cost maybe should be a little different, but the point is that the return on the investment is higher than the increase in the CPI. Now I'll talk a little bit about a very quick historical tours of rent regulations. And one of the things I would say about rent control, there are a lot of debates about whether the rent control is good or it's evil or whatever. There's very little analysis of the actual policies of rent control, how different laws, and the laws drastically differ, how they've impacted, what impact they've had. It's almost like a blank slate. They're not, looking at one law, this is what happened in this city with this type of law, this is what happened in this city with this type of law. The other thing I'd say about some of the rent regulation is you always hear the old saying, you don't want to see how they make laws and you don't want to see how they make sausages. Well, commonly, not always, the other thing that's happened with, I'd say a favorite tool for drafting laws, including rent control laws, is a copy machine. I'd say with all due respect for city attorneys, they love copy machines. And so often what happens is a law in a particular city will be considered, well, this is the best law, so we'll just copy this law. And nobody will talk to the people in that city to find out how the different aspects of the law actually worked. And I'm not saying it's an easy task to find out how things actually work. There's not much data and people don't always want to tell you what doesn't work, but it's essential when you're drafting a law to try to find out how much it's actually worked. And the other thing I'd say, and I'll go into this in detail, is that the different parts of the law are very much interrelated. So when you take something from another law, you also have to look at it, how it relates to the other parts of the law that you're putting it in. Now, going through the history of rent control, it's had, I don't know what you'd say, a interesting, very varied history. When New York City adopted rent control and rent control became famous or infamous, there were no annual rent increases allowed. The only rent increases that were permitted were 15% increases on vacancy. Well, of course, that's not an incentive for maintaining a building well, because if the building's well maintained, the tenants won't leave and you won't get your 15% vacancy increases. And of course, then with this type of law, there were huge variations within a building about which how much rent the individual tenants were paying. It was an incentive to harass tenants who had been there a long time, so you could try to get in tenants who would move more frequently. And of course, then there were stereotypes about the person who had lived in the unit for 50 years, forever, and pay hardly any rents. Then outside of New York City, the first peacetime rent controls came to the New Jersey and Boston area in the early 1970s. New Jersey adopted an eviction for cause law, but then the cities adopted rent control ordinances. And during that period, the inflation rates were high. Cities adopted laws that typically limited the annual increases to less than the CPI. And often they had separate pass-throughs for property tax increases apart from the annual increases. Now, most of the laws in New Jersey have vacancy decontrol, and they still limit the annual increases to less than the CPI. So of course, I haven't seen studies of this, empirical studies, but I assume there are huge variations in the rents among the tenants in a building. Then rent control came to California at the end of the 1970s or early 1980s. And it was a very interesting situation because you've heard about Prop 13 in California. Well, there was high inflation in California. Rents were going up by a lot. But then Prop 13 was proposed, and advocates would say, well, you know, your rents won't go up because property tax, owners often said we have to increase their rents because of property taxes were going up. So of course, tenants expected their rents would go down because Prop 13 cut property taxes by 2/3. Well, in fact, two things. One, property taxes are not a big percentage of rental income. But second, the more important thing was the rents did not go down because it was a hot market and the tenants were very disappointed. And there was one thing that spurred the widespread passage of rent control. The models for the rent control ordinances were quite different among the cities. The big cities adopted rent control with vacancy decontrol. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland. Los Angeles, besides the vacancy decontrol, rent increases, apartment owners could get capital improvement increases very easily. There was no debt service pass-through, and there were utility surcharges, which might have made sense, let's say 1% for gas, 1% for electricity, and there were times when utility costs were going up at a rapid rate, and in a small percentage, some percentage of the buildings, the owners were paying for these utilities, not a high percent. But the thing is, these utility pass-throughs became permanent, even though the changes in the constant growth in utility costs stopped. San Francisco adopted a law that originally allowed 7% annual increases. Inflation rate was even higher than that, plus CPI. Then the law was eventually amended to limit annual increases to 60% of the CPI. San Jose, for about a 20-year period, authorized 8% increases plus vacancy decontrol, plus a debt service pass-through. Well, I would say that was like being in heaven. It was better than the free market. And Oakland, for many years, Oakland had vacancy decontrol, and for many years it had debt service pass-through and a huge number of, and it still allows capital improvement increases and still has a huge number of cases. And the debt service pass-through basically meant if a building was, new purchaser could come in and say, well, my debt service went way up, therefore I should get a rent increase. Berkeley and Santa Monica did something different. First of all, those cities didn't have vacancy decontrol. And what happened is, and I was involved in doing these kind of studies, the annual increases were determined by doing a weighted operating cost study. The theory was, well, the CPI is not a good measure because the market basket of cost for an apartment building, they don't consist of food or transportation. They consist of a different basket of goods. So annual operating cost studies were done to see how much apartment cost went up. But basically what happened is, first of all, half of rental income or more is net operating income. So it makes sense to adjust that by the CPI. The other thing is you couldn't measure operating cost for management and maintenance, so you had to assume that those went up by the CPI. And the only thing that you could measure were property tax increases. Those were published and known. Of course, in California, your property taxes only went up 2% unless you sold the building. Utility cost could be measured because you could look at the rates, but utility costs are only a small percentage of rent. So let's say water costs go up 15%, but they're only 2% of rent. So what happened is these elaborate studies were done. They were very interesting to perform. I collected a lot of data, but they were very complicated, and people would be much happier and more trustful if they just see the rents are adjusted by the CPI. So, and this, I'd say the CPI is a fair measure because, as I say, it's measuring, you're setting the growth in net operating income, or that's what you're adjusting, and you're adjust maintenance and managed expenses, which go up by the CPI, or you have to assume they do, because you can't study those very easily. So basically what we've had, Berkeley though, what happened was with these annual operating increase studies, it only allowed a rent increase that was adequate to cover the operating cost increases. It didn't allow a rent increase that would allow growth in net operating income. So this was a very, very strict rent control. Well, basically, apartment owners, of course, went to the state legislature and said, this is not fair. And, and we should have mandate vacancy decontrol for all cities. So in around 1996, the state passed a law that said all rent control ordinances have vacancy decontrol. So now you have a situation where the cities are limiting annual increases, some of them to the CPI, some less, and you have vacancy decontrol. And, California pretty much most of the time is considered to be a hot market. So now you have a sort of a dual realities under the California rent control. You have the long-term tenants who are paying low rents by current standards, but there's a high turnover. Americans move pretty often from their apartments. So the majority of units, the rent has been set at market levels within the last 5 years. And so you have the recent movers and the long-term tenants. One thing cities have had to do in response to the situation, of course, there's a lot of incentive to have long-term tenants move. So the cities have had to pass a lot of laws dealing with protecting tenants from being pushed out. And there have been a lot of rules passed about evictions, that first of all, in small buildings, if there's an owner occupancy, it has to be bona fide, it has to be for a certain period, et cetera, because I don't think you want a situation where you can get a building exempt or apartment exempt by moving in for 3 months and moving out. Also, the cities have passed laws that make it harder to evict somebody for a minor violation. There have to be warning periods, et cetera. I can't recount all the details of the laws, but what's happened is that the cities have had to tighten their eviction control protections because of the vacancy decontrol. And I'd say this, in some cities, it's more in New Jersey than in New Jersey, some of the cities allow limited increases on vacancies, and you can debate about whether or not that's a good policy, because still over time, you create this split in rents. If you have the vacancy increases, besides limiting the amount that the rent can be increased on vacancies, the frequency can be limited of these increases. So somebody doesn't get this type of increase every year. And you can also have a ceiling on the total amount of vacancy increases. These are policy issues. And I'm not saying you should have that kind of approach, but I'm pointing out the alternatives. Now I'll comment on some other issues quickly. There are many issues that come up in designing a rent control ordinance. One is some cities allow capital improvement increases, others don't. My view is if you have full CPI increases, which is a normal market, the rent increases are adequate to cover the cost of capital improvements. And capital improvements are basically replacements. They're not new swimming pools in a building that didn't have one. And they're a cost that's anticipated when you set the price to buy a building. You have to, you know this is going to be part of the cost. And plus, if you have full CPI increases or near that, you have a growing net operating income. And some cities have, a few cities have allowed capital improvement pass-throughs for favored types of improvements, ones that improve energy efficiency, et cetera. And that's a type of policy you can consider. And of course, some types of capital improvements might benefit the tenants. For example, if tenants are paying for gas and electricity, and if you have building efficiency measures, that might reduce the amount of gas and electricity they need to heat and supply their units with energy. In New Jersey, some of the cities have property tax pass-throughs, but I think, again, if you have full CPI, this would be covered by this. Another issue is banking, and cities do it in various ways. When I say banking of rent increases, storing a rent increase that you don't take in a particular year. I'd say it's a wise idea to allow banking, because otherwise the apartment owners in the situation are use it or lose it. So of course they'll want to take all the rent. If they don't take all the rent increases they can get, they'll lose them. Well, the tenant will benefit if they don't take all the rent increases they will get. And I'd say if you have banking, with the banking provisions, though, I think it's important to have notice to tenants each year of amount that is banked, so a tenant doesn't just let's say rents aren't increased for years, but the tenant doesn't realize that they could be increased substantially and be surprised. Another issue is disproportionately low rents, because when you adopt rent control and you have your CPI increases or whatever you choose for the annual increases, somebody will walk in and say, this is not fair. I haven't raised the rents in 15 years. Well, there are ways, and ordinances have addressed this issue in particular ways, because one is through the fair return process, which I'll describe. Another is to have special regulations that if you've increased the rents less than a certain amount, over a certain period, you can get an additional increase. For example, if you haven't increased the rents in the last 5 years, if you've only increased them 5%, you can have some kind of mechanism. The big thing is adjusting for historical low rents does not mean bringing everybody up to the average. The purpose is to address outliers where the rent conditions don't reflect market conditions. And actually, this concept became really big because in a case in West Hollywood, California, the rents hadn't been increased in an apartment building for 20 years. And basically, the owner had turned over the maintenance to the tenants. The other thing is, of course, you're going to be dealing with exemptions, whether you just exempt buildings with a certain number of units or whether you just exempt owner-occupied buildings with a certain number of units. And I'd say, but this is just a generalization, I'd say owner-occupied buildings, I think the rent setting process is less of a market process. They're living with the other tenants. And you have a very sticky situation if you're in owners in a 2-unit building, for example, they don't get along with the tenant, and if they have to permanently live with the tenant. And it's not a market type of situation. I would say it's important to require registration of apartment units, the annual rents, etc. First of all, it's an enforcement tool. Secondly, it's an important information tool so you know what's actually happening. Because otherwise, if you don't have that type of information, basically your policy making is based on anecdotes and testimony. And also the rent control program should have annual reports about what's happened. If people get petitioned for certain type of increases, how many people have gotten those type of increases, how much rents have gone up, how much turnover there's been in tenants, et cetera. That information should be there. When you're making policy, you should have information. Now I'll talk about fair return. Fair return is complex and it's not easily understood. Fair return is a constitutional right. The courts have said, well, it's a constitutional right, but it's a legislative task to determine what's a fair return. And how will the court, and the courts have said no particular type of fair return standard is required, but the result must be reasonable. Well, the problem is this is a circular type of reasoning because what method for determining fair return you use will determine what's result is reasonable. And the courts have had a great difficulty in defining fair return. Historically, even in rate regulation, this was in utilities, the court said you had in the late 1800s, and this stuck for 50 years, you had to give owners a fair, or utilities a fair return on value. Then in World War II, the Supreme Court figured out that that approach was circular because the value of a property is determined by the rents. So if you're using the value, the rents determine the value, so how can you use the value to determine the rents? It's a circular process. Then what happened is some cities have a list of factors that will be considered determining what's a fair rent, but they won't have a standard. Here's a list of factors you can consider. And the courts have not said this is unconstitutionally vague, but the problem is when you have that kind of standard, there's no predictability because each arbitrator or hearing officer, et cetera, will use a different standard for what's determining what's a fair rent. And each case will start with a debate about how you should determine what the fair rent will be.
sorry to interrupt. This is Philip, one of the co-chairs. I just am noting on the clock, we are at 15 minutes to the end of the meeting, and I note that a number of people have raised questions. I just wonder if we could move to questions soon.
Okay. Well, I'll just say very quickly, then give me 5 more minutes. So then there are proposals that there should be a return on investment formula. Well, that sounds very reasonable. Everybody should get a fair rate of return on investment. But the problem is, in a rent control context, that is also circular, because the more you invest, the more return you're allowed. And the only ceiling then becomes the market. It's return on investment is not a control of the rents. The formula that cities have widely adopted in California is maintenance of net operating income. And that's a sensible approach, and the courts have praised it, because there've been lots of fair return cases, because basically the way that formula works, the net operating income you had before rent regulation, a fair return is that net operating income you had before regulation, adjusted by a consumer price index factor. So basically, under that type of formula, you're entitled to a growing net operating income that covers your cost increases, et cetera. So the big thing I'd say for a takeaway message is, I think it's the best type of rent control is one where the rent increases are based on the CPI increase. If you have less than the CPI increase, then the law has to be complemented with different individual adjustment mechanisms, which are complicated. When you have vacancy decontrol, if you have a tight market, you end up in basically a split between the vacancy decontrol rents that are high, the long-term tenants with low rents. You have it's not an inducement to maintenance, because it's inducement to hopefully get high turnover in tenants. What you want to do when you adopt a law, you're not going to get a perfect result. What you want to do is get a reasonable result, taking into account the competing public and private interest. And I'd say you want a simple law rather than a complicated law. And so now we're open for questions.
Great.
I hope I've cleared up some things rather than made things more confusing.
I'm sure we won't have enough time for everybody's questions, but I'm just going to go in the order that they came in, either in the chat or raised hands. So first was Tony Barranca.
Ken, I appreciate you getting up early. Quite frankly, I didn't find much of the information new from what the Cura team had presented, nor effective. The first point that you made regarding residential being regulated, I'm not so sure that that differs from anything from restaurants to industrial buildings to factories to hospitals to schools. And literally every type of physical improvement we have is governed by zoning and other things. Can you comment on why you feel as though residential is more uniquely regulated than literally every other physical type of asset that we construct?
Well, I'd say this, the supply is heavily regulated. That is the difference. And the consumption, in a way, is compulsory. You can't decide, well, the rents are too high, I'll live in a tent. So if you compulsory consumption, if you can, and the supply is heavily regulated, by zoning, by zoning regulations, et cetera.
Precisely, just like every other form of commercial real estate.
Well, I'd say the consumption isn't compulsory in other types of real estate. That's the difference. I mean, it's only so many restaurants, but if the restaurants prices are high, people don't have to go to a restaurant. And there's a big difference when you have compulsory consumption, and it's a necessity.
Healthcare is a match. Healthcare is predictable. It's needed. and it's there. In many parallels, it would be there. I think you could potentially bring that argument up for restaurants.
Well, I don't think okay.
I had a
I don't
second
think-
question though, and I think this is the most important question that you can share with the group. You did an example whereby you had a chart of an investment of $300,000 into a multifamily building, presumed, because it's larger than single family.
Right.
And I posed a question in the chat that said, if you were an investor that had that $300,000 and you could invest it in a regulated market versus an unregulated market, I would like your professional opinion as to what the incentive structure is set up for you to do. Is it set up for you to invest the $300,000 in a regulated or unregulated market?
Well, I'd say a critical determinant is the risk. What do you say? You're saying stop. And so a regulated market might be much less risky. And, sure, you can invest in a shopping center or some other or whatever, but it's not as secure. It might not be as a secure investment. It might be a better investment, and it might be a worse investment. And you said when the supply of other types of things are regulated, I don't think, let's say the supply of hospitals or whatever, I don't think there's, going back to your first comment, I don't think they're so strictly regulated that there could be a shortage.
I want to
But
make
housing is slightly
regulated.
portable as well. You could go just literally across the river or across the street to be in a different municipality, correct?
Tony, I
Well,
want to
that
make sure we have time for other folks who have questions. So if it's all right, we'll move to Cecile is next. Cecile, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Hang on.
Let's go to a different questioner and come back to Cecile in a second. Next up was Malik Davis.
I was just curious on your position. A lot of these properties you listed had mortgages. How do you position homeowners that don't have mortgages as far as their fair rate of return?
Well, okay, you don't make the fair return. You're allowing a certain growth in net operating income for all properties. And owners will get different rates of growth in equity depending on their mortgage arrangements, how heavily they're financed. But if you made the fair return standard dependent on particular financing, it could be manipulated the standard. So basically, it gives everybody the same growth in net operating income, and it's up to them to determine their financing arrangements and how much they invest and how much they borrow. And you will have different rates of growth in equity under that standard.
Thanks. Let's try Cecile again.
Can I just clarify that statement?
Go ahead.
So are you looking at a fair rate of return on a general sense of people? I'm just using hypothetical. 4 or 5 different people had a 2-bedroom house that they were renting in the same price point. Are you using all of their data input to come up with that number as far as their fair rate of return?
No, these are base profit systems. So basically, you had a certain net operating income before regulation. Whatever it is, 100,000. Will a fair net operating income today is that amount adjusted by the consumer price index. So
that's the increase. Okay.
And of course, the net operating income is different for every building, but basically, you're adjusting the you're preserving the return by adjusting it by inflation, and you're increasing it. And of course, typically it's on a leveraged investment, so you're getting a good rate of return.
Thanks, Ken. 2 more questions, and then we have to do some wrap up. Cecile?
So that's more of a comment. Thanks. One is the data that you showed where you were comparing the rent increases to the CPI. I just wanted to point out, assuming that you're using the statistical area, which includes Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington, correct? Is that what you were?
Right, yes, yes.
And so my point is just for the group to just be really, we just have to be careful of the data that we're looking at, because that's not necessarily what's happened in St. Paul, whose market is really different than Minneapolis. It just is. The other question, you made a comment, I think correctly, that there was high development in cities that have rent control. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, I'd say in California, most of the apartment construction has been in the cities that have rent control.
Okay, because we've talked about that in this group, but Kira didn't have data that showed that in other, we didn't see definitive data around that cause and effect. So I was just curious about it. But it was just germane to just California, it sounds like.
Well, I'd say, I mean, most laws exempt new construction. And so there've been high rates of new construction where you can build in the big cities, which have rent control. Not all of them have, allowed more construction. And basically the problem we have in California is the suburbs that, severely restrict where you can build, and say a high percentage in the suburbs in the Bay Area have had no apartment construction, or virtually none, because there's land use controls.
Then the last thing is just a favor. I'm wondering if you could quickly do a study on what pieces of the rent control laws really work, so we don't have to call everybody. That would be really helpful. You had made a comment that we have to call to really see what pieces worked and what didn't work, and as we're trying to figure out which ones.
Well, I'd say the thing is, if you have certainly tying the annual increases to the CPI, so that you don't, if you have, the farther you go, if you go down from CPI, then you need more individual adjustment mechanisms, or there's an argument for them. If you have a fixed percentage, if that is terrible. I mean, if you know what the inflation rate is going to be in the future, you have more power than I do.
Last question from Koo, and then I've got to wrap us up. And I see Kevin's question. I think that's for us, but go ahead, Koo.
It's not as much as a question, it's just a statement that I think we have to be careful when we're putting out examples showing 96% return, 89% return, without addressing the time frame in which that comes into play. A 96% return on a 10-year hold is a 9.6 return on investment, which is a lot lower than a 96% return. So I just want to make sure that the group understands that when these examples are being put out there, I think having a time period attached to it is going to really be helpful for an understanding of some realistic expectations. So.
I think that's a critical point. And one thing I'd say, when they're high inflation periods, apartment owners are doing, much better than if there's a low inflation period, because you have a leveraged investment.
Thank you, Ken. We are right at the end of our 2 hours, so I just have a couple of kind of wrapping up the meeting things. I know that there are a lot more questions and comments that are out there that folks have. So we'll leave it to Kira to sort of figure out if there's a way to get those into the survey or something. But we do want to honor people's time. So next week, I think when we started out, next week was kind of an open slot on the calendar. So I just want to tell people what's there, because I don't think it's, we've announced that. So with much appreciation to Robbie Grossman, one of the members of our task force here, after one of our meetings a few weeks ago, he contacted Tony and me and Ed about the idea of having someone who has real expertise in the discrimination and racial inequities in housing in the Twin Cities give us a kind of common understanding of that. We have someone coming from the Mapping Prejudice Project for half of our time next week to do that. So thank you to Robbie for that suggestion. And then the second half of the time, or roughly half of the time next week, will be starting to kind of straw poll about actual policy mechanisms. So we'll have a survey that we'll actually do in the meeting rather than after the meeting. to be starting to get a sense of where people are on different policy questions, not voting, not making decisions, not packaging things together, anything like that, but just to get a sense now that we're kind of through the content of where people are on some of the key policy questions. Also, just want to flag for everyone that tomorrow you should expect to see the flyer from Kira for the public meeting that will be the week after next, the 12th. And that'll have information about the public meeting and how people can participate both at the meeting and submitting their comments or testimony otherwise. So just wanted to, it's not quite ready for today, but everyone will be able to share that and encourage public participation. And then I just wanted on a personal note to mention, I am not able to participate in next week's meeting. So I hope it is a great meeting. I'll watch afterwards and leave you in Tony's capable hands. So thank you, everybody. Sorry that we've gone a couple minutes past. But really appreciate all the discussion, and we'll figure out if there are ways to do more of it based on Ken's presentation.
And thank you to you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ken. Have a great, well, hopefully you take a nap today and get a little sleep